I encourage your listeners to look up a pangolin. I mean, they are the most ridiculously cute, adorable animals.
It looks like an armadillo.
It looks like an armadillo. They're unbelievably cute. When they're scared, they roll into a ball.
This is ClimateTech with Kentaro, a podcast featuring the brightest minds and most influential voices in climate tech. I'm your host, Kentaro Kawamori. Pangolins, gorillas, and baby cheetahs. We have a whole zoo in today's episode about biodiversity. I shared a fantastic conversation with Vian Sharif, Head of Sustainability at FNZ and founder of NatureAlpha. Both FNZ and NatureAlpha are platforms for investors. FNZ is a digital wealth management platform, while Vian's newer venture NatureAlpha focuses on demonstrating the impacts of investments on biodiversity and natural capital. To kick us off, Vian told me about an experience she had in sub-Saharan Africa. There she had a moment of clarity that led her to integrate conservation work with investments.
For me, it was a journey that began in a Land Rover on the plains of Africa, where I'd started a career in asset management and I was involved in our charitable efforts. And because the company that I was working for had been founded in South Africa, we ended up choosing to work with conservation charities. So this was very much focused on the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa. And at that time, I started traveling to these incredible places. So I remember this one moment where everything changed for me, which then catalyzed the work that I'm doing now at FNZ, and the founding of NatureAlpha. I wonder if anyone that's listening can resonate with these experiences, which is sometimes there are these perfect moments in nature where, for me at that time, the sun was setting on this incredible African plain in the middle of Kenya. And out of the corner of our eyes, we stopped the Land Rover because we saw a baby cheetah. And this baby cheetah started coming towards us, crept step by step by step. And I could see that the guys in the car were getting progressively more worried the closer it came. But anyway, as it kept coming closer to the vehicle, I just realized that the world in which we live is completely priceless. The effect that nature has on us, and then the preciousness of these areas of biodiversity, which remain untouched, the wild places in our world, then moving on to the areas of forest, the areas of priceless forest in terms of the Amazon, or in terms of the areas of sub-Saharan Africa, which is still covered by incredible areas of tree cover and incredible biodiversity. These are areas that are so priceless to our lives, but we don't always have a connection with. What that moment suddenly made me realize was that if we don't do something to protect this, then it will vanish, it will disappear and potentially never come back.
UN reports show that over 1 million species are currently threatened with extinction. And due to climate change, 75% of terrestrial environments have been severely altered. To address these staggering numbers, Vian looked into how she could help investors realize the impact of their financial decisions.
And that catalyzed a moment for me which changed the course of my life. It made me start to understand that there was a way to think about how we can effect change at scale. And the one lever that was available to me at that time was understanding the world of investment. So when we make capital allocation decisions, when we choose where we're going to invest our money, whether that's you or me, in terms of our 401k or in terms of our pension, wherever we are, long-term savings, or whether I'm an asset manager choosing where to invest money, or whether I'm an asset owner with billions of dollars worth of money to allocate, I can start to select the companies and the countries where I put my money. And in doing so, I'm essentially backing behaviors of companies, or I can, through engagement, start to shape the direction of those companies or potentially even countries as I invest in them. And so that for me was interesting. How are people making these decisions, and how are we using data around environmental, social, and governance factors to understand what countries and companies are doing in this space? And what I realized was that there was this big hole for nature. There were some elements around how companies were emitting carbon or their waste practices or the sort of water usage that they were measuring. But actually, when it comes to understanding where's the biggest interface of a company with precious biodiversity or important areas of biodiversity and nature, it was very, very untouched at that time. And so I made it my mission to see whether we could start to integrate nature considerations into investment managers' investment decisions. And that's where NatureAlpha was born.
And how does that manifest itself, whether you're a company or you're an asset manager? When you talk about incorporating that into investment decisions, is that, conservation? Is that the concept of sort of doing no evil? But, to me, we talked about that concept of nature positive, right? I think it's now moving into how do you actually do more than just not do badly? What does that look like in this space?
Up until fairly recently, there was an understanding that you make investment decisions on one hand, and then you can give back in terms of your philanthropic giving, whether you're an individual or whether you're a company. But increasingly, you look at the World Economic Forum's top risks in terms of their 2021 or 2022 reports, and you start to see that environmental issues top that list. What you might not realize is that the same things topped the list 10 years ago. So the fact that there was pressure on the environment, pressure around biodiversity loss, has not gone away, and it hasn't improved. In fact, we've got to the stage where 1 million species are at risk of extinction. We're facing unprecedented losses in this space, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So how do we start to address this balance? Well, potentially it's not necessarily about saying, okay, well, here are my activities and here's how I'm going to give back philanthropically. Actually, it could be that as part of my investment decision making, now we're seeing the rise of interest in understanding not just the financial aspects of a company's performance or a sovereign bond's performance, but also how is it performing from the perspective of its impact on the environment, its impact on society, and how it's governed. And so if now we can build on this $44 trillion worth of money that is being run with some sort of ESG consideration by adding in a dimension on nature, and we can talk about what sort of dimensions we can add here, then can we start to influence how decisions are made in terms of which companies we invest in, not just from the perspective of how they're doing financially, but also from the perspective of how they're performing in relation to biodiversity or nature. And in doing so, could we actually start to turn the tide of some of these environmental issues that we're facing?
This is fascinating. I never thought about, things like pandemics and virology being linked to destruction of biodiversity and nature and those things. And of course, we've all heard of the ability to make new medical discoveries based on different species in the rainforest and those sorts of things. But it all is so closely connected and so relevant today, right? It's like the permafrost is releasing new pathogens that were locked in the ice and all those sort of things. So it's all these new risk vectors, which are just fascinating. So would definitely love to understand the dimensions a bit better.
It's really interesting you say that. Part of my PhD was all about why some of the world's most endangered species are indeed endangered. And part of this was the discovery of the world's most illegally trafficked mammal, which is called the pangolin.
The pangolin.
If you've ever seen a pangolin, I encourage your listeners to look up a pangolin. I mean, they're the most ridiculously cute, adorable animals.
It looks like an armadillo.
It looks like an armadillo. They're unbelievably cute. When they're scared, they roll into a ball. And unfortunately, this makes them very portable for illegal trafficking. And they're used as a delicacy in certain cultures and countries in traditional medicine. What's interesting is that having fallen in love with this little species called the pangolin, And having spent time in Vietnam building pangolariums and feeding them and all sorts of other building climbing frames for these pangolins, what was interesting was that in the start of the pandemic, it was thought, and there are some papers out there in the literature which suggest that the contact of animals like bats with animals like pangolins, and then that transmission into wet markets could have been responsible for the start of the pandemic, or certainly zoonotic disease transmission.
The origins of the pandemic are still unknown, but early theories blamed animals in meat markets in Wuhan, China, including the pangolin.
What we're seeing here is this sort of actually not unforeseen threat or risk of moving biodiversity into ever decreasing spaces and having species come into contact with other species that may not have happened previously. And so bringing these risks into sharp focus were elements like this crossover of the illegal wildlife trade, of biodiversity loss, of then the pandemic, of what was going on in environmental issues, until we have a very widely read tabloid paper here called The Sun. I don't know if you know it, but I remember seeing a pangolin on the front page of The Sun in relation to COVID and thinking, I never thought when I started looking at this in 2013 that I would ever see this or in this context. But sadly, I don't think this is going to be the end of this kind of risk arising.
Fascinating. I'm definitely going to be naming one of our conference rooms the Pangolarium going forward. And next time in Vietnam, we'll definitely be seeking that out. I had no idea. And no, of course, I'm a loyal People magazine reader. You know, I wouldn't read a rag like The Sun if my life depended on it. You know,
of course not.
Much more vested in what's happening domestically with Brangelina and Benifer, and I may be like 20 years behind on those covers, but whatever.
But I think, Kentaro, this is exactly it. And this is why I think today is such an interesting moment, particularly from the perspective of what you're doing, what we're doing, which is, people often ask, why is anything different today? And I think the answer to why things are different today and why we can start to reverse this 1 million species at risk stat. And by the way, the point of 1 million species being at risk, being a problem, is that biodiversity underpins so much of our global economy. In fact, everything we see around us is underpinned by biodiversity. Everything is a product of nature. Natural capital is just not really accounted for in the way that we live our lives in many ways. But I think it's a stat now that all of the SDGs in some way relate to biodiversity, but at least 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals won't be achieved unless we figure out how to preserve our natural heritage, i.e. preserve biodiversity.
In 2015, UN member states adopted the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. There are a total of 17 SDGs. These range from improving access to quality education to stopping biodiversity loss.
The point is, what's different today is that, just as you've said, you do have awareness amongst celebrities, whether it's His Royal Highness Prince William doing amazing work in this space, whether it's Leonardo DiCaprio, whether it is Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. They actually did some incredible work across Namibia. There is where it's Greta, there is awareness now that something is happening. But the two other trends that we're starting to see, and very specifically from your perspective, is regulation. So finally, the regulator is saying this is a systemic risk to society. This is a systemic risk in terms of biodiversity loss or climate change. Therefore, we have to start regulating. But then finally, the core piece that's different today from any time in the future is the technology we have available to actually make decision-making tools for the likes of investors, or in fact, the likes of you and me when we're looking at how to allocate our money. So this moment where at the nexus of these three crucial trends: awareness through popular actors, like the ones we've talked about, the fact that the regulator's saying, okay, this is a real problem now, we need you to start to disclose companies and decision makers what you're doing. And then finally, technology is available to actually enable us to get amazing transparency through satellite data, through reported data, through news activity on what companies and countries are doing in this space. And that's what's so unique about this moment in time. And that's why I'm so excited about what we're doing with NatureAlpha and FNZ.
Well, tell us about FNZ. So you're You work on the sustainability team. What does that mean for you all? What does the day-to-day look like for you there?
The day-to-day means being in this incredibly exciting space where I get to meet people like you who are propelling change forward in the world and supporting a wide range of different people in trying to achieve what they need to do, whether that's reporting on their climate impact or understanding the ESG impact of their investments. Ultimately, what we have at our fingertips here at FNZ is the ability to equip $1.5 trillion worth of individual investors. So we run platforms for tens of millions of investors, and we're able to show them using our ESG data and our platform tools, the actual environmental, societal, and governance elements of their investments. And in doing so, I don't know how many times we look at our phones these days, but the purpose of that is to enable us to make more informed decisions as end investors. So traditionally, we have a structure where you have the asset owners who own a lion's share of the pie in terms of capital allocations. They then work with the asset managers who create products in the space and invest the money. And then we have the likes of us who then choose, okay, I want to invest in this fund, or someone else invests our money. What we're doing is actually turning that entirely on its head, disrupting that. We're saying that you and I, any one of our listeners, can ask our financial advisor or take it upon ourselves to actually see the impact of the investments we make at the touch of a button, really democratizing access to understanding the impact of our investments on environmental issues or human rights issues or diversity issues, whatever it is we care about. We can now see that at the touch of a button because of the technology that we're operating. So I'm really interested to understand how this is all going to pan out over the next few years and see whether it really does disrupt things from that perspective, because we will have that power in our hands.
I think undoubtedly it will disrupt it. It's just a matter of how long it takes, in my opinion. So that's your day job at FNZ, and you've got another day job as an entrepreneur, and of course, a close partnership between FNZ and NatureAlpha as well. So tell us what you're up to at NatureAlpha. What are you building?
Oh, thank you, Kentaro. And also thanks for inspiring us to be able to do this from an entrepreneurial perspective. It's always really uplifting and gives you hope when you see someone who's achieved so much and you know that it could be possible to do something similar. So as I started this role at FNZ and we were working with all these ESG data feeds, as I mentioned, there was just this big hole for nature. And I thought, well, why? This is why I'm here. The whole purpose of why I'm here is to shift the world to a more sustainable place from a nature perspective. So the first thing I did was I went to my PhD professor at Oxford University, an amazing woman called Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland. And I said, EJ, can we start to think about how we can inform investors about their impact on nature and to see how we can develop something? Anyway, the academics continue to work on that thinking, and I hope very much one day we'll be able to bring their side of life into the picture at NatureAlpha. But alongside the work, daytime work for FNZ, weekends and evenings then all became all about how do we start to develop a toolkit for investors to help them understand their impact on nature. And so we got together some incredible data scientists, climate scientists, some geospatial scientists. So this is a very specific skill set where you're working with geolocational data. Where are protected areas? How do these maps overlay? Maps of watersheds, maps of protected areas, maps of tree cover. How do we start to integrate all of those things with understanding where companies are actually located? And then you start to build up these incredible pictures, this real visibility of how companies are operating in the world, because you can see. So you can start to ship in tree cover loss data over time. Global Forest Watch offers the ability to actually see real-time information on what's going on from a tree cover perspective. Just these incredible data sets combined with some really standard elements that we're all used to in the field of financial analysis, whether it be what a company's doing from the perspective of its products and services, or what sectors it's operating in. And then we brought in the scientific angle. We worked with IUCN, IBAT, incredible data sets, which have already been through the science, been through many minds. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Just pulling those elements together, everyone just said, oh, it's too challenging. Nature's too hard. We can't possibly get scalable data in this space. But actually, what we said was, let's start with what we have. And let's see if we can make that at least user-friendly to investors who don't have to be biodiversity experts. Let's face it, it's hard in the world of ESG even to understand the acronyms, let alone to go down the route of all the different alphabet soup of all the different standards and the frameworks and the specific ways we describe biodiversity and nature and natural capital. How do we make something actually user-friendly, and how do we give people a place to start? And that's what we did at NatureAlpha. So these two things we're hugely excited to combine, because once we can input the nature information into the end investor menu, then we will have achieved the dream, which is to be able to understand how we, whoever we are, can understand our impact on nature and start to make a difference.
A little bit of context for the audience. We met sort of just randomly when we were 10 minutes before walking onto a panel at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And I don't even remember what the panel was about, but I remember Marty O'Brien was on it as well, which is always great. And you were telling me about what you were up to, and then we connected before we left, and you showed me some of the early prototypes at the time, and then now recently you've just launched and you've got live code in production. So that's super, super exciting. It's always fun to see that journey, and you've done it in a short amount of time. So great work on getting it all up and running. It's a chasm that few ever cross. Entering the world of zeros and ones and fusing that with this concept of nature is not an easy task.
The journey of bringing something like that to life is as much about translating this mission that you have in your head to someone who can actually execute it, or several people who come together to execute it. And I think that's been a massively rewarding journey, but also a very challenging one. But the thing that I always come back to is the tidal wave of nature-related disclosure is coming. It started in the EU. I think we're still early, even in the EU, and it's going to expand beyond its borders through to Japan. We've talked about that, and then out to the US and more broadly, until we'll look back in, 5-10 years and say, well, that was always part of what we did, wasn't it? And I think being at the start of that and being sometimes frustratingly early, it is challenging. But what I always go back to is just being in the natural environment, those moments I described to you in Kenya, having the opportunity to live with indigenous people, whether it be in the Amazon or whether it be in the north of Kenya or whether it be in Colombia, and learning from them that we have to live in relationship with our environment if we are to learn to understand it and respect it. And coming back to that mission time and time again, where it's not even a matter of how am I going to do this? It's just, when are we going to do this? Has been incredibly helpful, as well as the guidance that you and others have provided to keep going.
Well, that's the fun part of our ecosystem, as you've learned. It's, the entrepreneurial community is always pretty collaborative in most cases, but, the ClimateTech community certainly, I think, is the most collaborative I've ever seen. So it's always a blast. And when you get to do it with great people, that's always the key driver, I think, for many of us. I know your family is from the Middle East, and would love to just have the audience learn a little bit more about your journey, because a founder with your background in software and data broadly is uncommon, and we should talk about that and we should celebrate that, because that's something that's should certainly be highlighted and we need more of. And so I'm always fascinated at hearing your perspectives and your background.
Oh, well, thank you, Kentaro. I guess it was a bit unusual. So my parents came from Iraq. Not that I look particularly Iraqi, but they came over here to Edinburgh just before I was born. And they left a country which actually is an interesting poster child we always think of countries as generally improving over time. And I remember my parents always saying, oh, yeah, one day we'll go back to Iraq, when it's better, when it's better, when it's better. And you look back 30 years and really it's just got worse and worse. And I always think the greatest gift my parents ever gave me was a chance to live in a democratic society that is open, and for all its issues and challenges, the way we live is so privileged, really, when we look around. And so I grew up in London, and my parents were both doctors, and they said, whatever you do, don't be a doctor. And I said, that's fine by me, because though they are mission driven, the life of a doctor and two doctors together does not make for a particularly happy time in general. I don't know.
And they meant medical doctor.
Medical doctors, two medical doctors. Basically, if you were clever in Iraq, you either did medicine, engineering, or law.
Well, that's what you did. Like the Asian American community here as well, right? That is the American dream for those. It's those three things.
That's right. And I think being, immigrants into this country, it was always about fitting in and contribution and how you could make the most of the environment in which you lived and the incredible privilege that we enjoyed. And when I look at my family now, some of whom are still in Iraq, I think, my goodness, what a different life that would have been. We really are equipped with every privilege and every choice. I certainly feel very blessed to have had that. And then whilst I was at school, it was never going to be sciences. Particularly for me, it was always going to be English and the arts. So ended up going to Cambridge, loved it. And then really the big change in my life was when I started work at the investment company I mentioned to you, which was called NatureAlpha, now called 91, founded in South Africa, and just the most extraordinary global perspective on the world. And that's what took me to sub-Saharan Africa and really changed the way that I looked at life, changed my mission. I remember going, as I've said, to Kenya, but not just Kenya, to Congo, where we did a lot of work with Virunga National Park. I'd encourage everyone to watch the film Virunga. It's on Netflix. It was second in line for an Oscar, but it's really the perfect description of how investment, resources, and the conflict between that and preserving natural heritage just come into play, come into conflict. This was Africa's oldest national park. It's home to some of the world's most precious biodiversity from the perspective of the mountain gorillas there, some of the last remaining mountain gorillas. And yet oil was discovered underneath the park. Even though it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, there was prospecting which began to be done for the oil under the park. And then we get into lots of different questions. Whose right is it to make a decision about that particular part of the world? Who can make decisions about whether we protect our heritage or whether it's more important for the local economy to think about its resource use? Anyway, the most incredible story, a park run by Emmanuel de Merode, who was the only thing standing between the oil and the park, but managed through very dramatic circumstances to turn it around, to create hydroelectric power around the park, which then meant that the park was worth something to the local community alongside the tourism that he managed to create. So working there, working and meeting the most incredible conservationists, collaring elephant to try and track the last remaining wildlife there, just opened my eyes to the mission of people who dedicated themselves to something bigger. And that sometimes means, life or death. It's not about counting species necessarily. It's literally about facing off to organized criminals with big guns. And so that inspired me to want to do something about it. How do we support the protection of this gift that we all have as a world? How do we support these individuals who are doing absolutely incredible things and essentially dedicating their lives and putting their lives on the line for us? I had a friend at the time who I was working with, and he said, if you want to do something about it, you need to be taken seriously. Why don't you go and do your PhD? And so putting all those things together, putting the passion that I had for conservation, having worked with some NGOs and on the ground, together with the chance to live with indigenous people, the chance to meet these conservationists, and then look at the world of finance, investment management, and technology to bring it all together. It's this strange combination of elements that I didn't choose, but just sort of happened to put me here talking to you today.
You hit on a number of really relevant topics there. The storytelling is so incredibly important. And I've spent a lot of time recently talking about the sort of the direction of the storytelling that's really been centered around FUD for so long, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, when it comes to climate change and adverse nature impact. It doesn't work, right? People don't want to watch stuff like that. And there's a reason that most people have a problem and sort of just put those scale of problems to the back of their head. But the stories of the folks, like you mentioned, that are creating change, that are super inspirational, which is a word you've used a few times, I think we're starting to see more and more of that. And I'm excited for the work you're doing and the TNFD framework broadly, because I think that actually becomes a key tool that enables storytelling for the corporates and the asset managers, right? Because they should then be celebrated for the work that they're doing and deploying their resources and capital towards making that impact, and being able to tell it in the first place is a really key part of that story, right? Okay, before we call it a wrap, here's my rapid fire round with Vian. Best thing about being an entrepreneur so far?
Freedom.
Worst thing about being an entrepreneur so far?
Frustration, not going fast enough.
Most exciting part of the nature discussion overall for you?
Mainstreaming it.
Biggest surprise as you've gone onto your entrepreneurial journey?
Oh, the support. The collaboration.
Excellent. And then last and most importantly, your favorite pangolorium?
But there are two in the world. One in South Africa and one in Vietnam.
There's only two?
One in South Africa. Yeah, there are not many.
Wow. How big are they?
The pangolarium, small, tiny. One's in Cuc Phong National Park in Vietnam. And one is somewhere in South Africa, I think near Cape Town. So worth a visit, I would say, if you want to build climbing frames for pangolins.
I think we should also start a petition to rename pangolins to pangolorians. As you can see in my video here, I'm a big fan of The Mandalorian, and maybe putting those two concepts together would be great. And now, on that extremely unproductive note, I thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Kentaro, thank you so much, and congratulations on everything you're doing. May it be a huge success. Already is.
Make sure to check out Vian Sharif and her work with NatureAlpha and FNZ. Also, make sure to look up a picture of a pangolin if you don't know what they look like. You'll thank me later. Links to Vian's work are in our show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with another fantastic episode next week. Catch you all then. ClimateTech with Kentaro is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Hueman Group Media. Our theme music is by Guest House. And if you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website at persefoni.com.